The field lay quiet on the outskirts of Prospect, a patch of dry grass and silence bordered by wire fencing and scattered debris. It was the kind of forgotten place people passed without noticing, a stretch of land between the suburbs and the bush, neither here nor there. On the morning of February 5th, 1986, it became the site of something terrible. A local farmer walking the perimeter of his property saw something that didn't belong. At first it looked like discarded clothing tangled in the undergrowth, but as he stepped closer, a shape began to emerge. Human. Motionless. Partially concealed by the tall grass and summer dust. He backed away and called the police. The first officers arrived quickly, followed by detectives and forensic teams. They found a woman's body lying near the base of a slight incline, exposed to the elements. The ground bore signs of a struggle. Her clothing was torn, her hands bruised, her face swollen. There were drag marks, shoe imprints, broken stems of grass, evidence of movement, of force, of cruelty. But in those first moments, they didn't know who she was. They cordoned off the area. Photographs were taken. Markers were placed in the dirt. The heat pressed down on the officers as they moved methodically, silently around the scene. No one spoke unless they had to. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Within hours, the identification came. A missing nurse from the western suburbs, last seen 3 nights earlier. Her name was Anita-Cobby. But the question remained. How had she come to be here, in this lonely place, so far from where she was meant to be? In 1986, Australia was jolted by a crime so savage, so unfathomable, that it etched itself into the national psyche. At its center was Anita-Cobby, a 26-year-old nurse and former beauty queen, whose life ended not in scandal or controversy, but in silence, in a lonely paddock on the outskirts of Sydney. The country would come to know every detail of her death, but in the early days, what lingered was the mystery. A missing woman, a quiet suburb, and a community unprepared for the darkness that had quietly moved among them. The suburb of Blacktown, nestled in western Sydney, was in many ways unremarkable. A working-class neighborhood shaped by post-war migration and suburban sprawl, it carried the mood of a place in transition. Factory workers, nurses, teachers, and clerks populated its modest homes. The railway station was the artery connecting residents to the heart of the city, but few in Blacktown dreamed of glamour. It was a place of routine and modest ambition, where families clung to security and neighbors nodded to each other at corner stores. In the 1980s, Western Sydney was known for its grit. The economy was shifting, and with it came pockets of disillusionment. Youth unemployment was high, and crime, though not rampant, hovered at the edges. Still, Blacktown was not known for horror. It was not a place that birthed headlines. It was ordinary, and that ordinariness was part of its promise. It offered quiet nights, a place to raise children, and a sense of stability, even if frayed at the edges. Anita-Cobby grew up not far from Blacktown, and despite the crown she once wore as Miss Western Suburbs, she remained grounded. She worked as a nurse at Sydney Hospital, where she was known for her empathy and work ethic. She had separated from her husband, but remained close to her parents, who she visited often. On February 2nd, 1986, she left work and boarded a train bound for the western suburbs, as she had done countless times before. There was no foreboding, no warning, just the end of another shift and the journey home. She was last seen walking along a darkened street in Blacktown. The payphone at the station was broken, and she had chosen to walk rather than wait. That choice, simple, rational, and made in a moment, would mark the beginning of a tragedy that would stain the streets of Blacktown forever. At that moment, she was just another woman walking home. No one knew what was about to unfold. Morning came to Blacktown as it always did, slow and unremarkable. The sun crept over tiled rooftops, shop shutters rolled open, and trains rattled eastward carrying workers into the city. There was no sign yet of what had been lost in the night. For Anita-Cobby's parents, however, the hours brought only silence. She had not come home. Calls to her workplace confirmed she had left her shift as scheduled. There was no argument, no apparent reason for concern, except her absence. They reported her missing. In the days that followed, Blacktown shifted from routine to restlessness. The police took the report seriously, but there was little to go on. A nurse walking alone at night. No witnesses, no clear evidence. Missing adults often return within days. That was the quiet hope. Yet her family knew Anita would not disappear without cause. Her life was structured, predictable, and filled with purpose. Every hour without contact deepened the fear. 3 days after her disappearance, that fear turned to horror. In a field near Prospect, just west of Blacktown, police found a woman's body. It was concealed in grass, left in the open, yet hidden from view. Her injuries were brutal, too brutal to be the result of a random act or opportunistic crime. There was no question. This was deliberate, prolonged, and violent. The coroner's findings would later confirm the worst. Anita had been abducted, beaten, raped, and finally murdered. News of the discovery rippled quickly. Local headlines gave way to national coverage. The photograph of Anita, smiling, poised, crowned in her pageant sash, stood in sharp contrast to the manner of her death. She was not just another victim. She was young, educated, caring. She represented promise, and that made the violation all the more profound. For Blacktown, the anonymity it once clung to was gone. Its streets had become the backdrop to a crime that would define it for a generation. As the investigation deepened, so did the public reaction. There was anger, disbelief, and a hunger for answers. The brutality of the crime shocked even seasoned officers. Few could make sense of what had happened. No suspect was yet named, no motive known. But what was clear, unequivocally, was that this had not been the work of one man. This was coordinated, controlled, and deeply disturbing. The suburb that once offered working-class quiet now stood under a new shadow. Blacktown, with its milk bars, driveways, and picket fences, became synonymous with something it never asked for, something monstrous, festering just beneath the surface. While Blacktown mourned, investigators worked in the background with growing urgency. The evidence told a story of overwhelming violence. More than one man could have inflicted alone. The state of the body, the drag marks in the field, the signs of prolonged suffering, all pointed to a group attack. This was not an impulsive act. It was sustained, coordinated, and ferocious. Police began revisiting old files, looking for familiar names among repeat offenders, known violent criminals, and parolees in the area. Among them emerged John Travers, a 19-year-old with a history marked by erratic and violent behavior. Travers was already known to law enforcement for cruelty to animals, a disturbing pattern that often foreshadows deeper violence. He was a troubled youth from Western Sydney's working-class neighborhoods, with a fractured family background and a reputation for aggression. His presence in the investigation raised alarm bells, but police suspected he was not acting alone. Travers was soon linked to 4 others, Michael Murdoch and the Murphy brothers, Michael, Gary, and Leslie. Each came from similarly tough backgrounds, shaped by unstable homes, economic hardship, and limited opportunities. The Murphy brothers had long brushes with the law, their youthful years punctuated by petty crimes and escalating violence. Murdoch was known locally for his reckless behavior and volatile temper. Together they formed a circle bound by shared dysfunction and a reckless disregard for consequences. Though young, These men had built a disturbing reputation in their communities. School was sporadic, work was scarce, and respect was sought through fear rather than achievement. The law had seen them repeatedly, but their actions had never escalated to the level that would foreshadow what was to come. The break in the case came quietly, from within their circle. Travers confided in his girlfriend's younger sister, revealing chilling details of the night Anita disappeared. Unable to bear the weight of his confession, she approached the police and agreed to assist in their investigation. Wearing a covert recording device, she captured Travers admitting to the crime, naming his accomplices and describing Anita's abduction and assault. Armed with this evidence, the police moved swiftly. Coordinated raids across western Sydney led to the arrests of all 5 men within days. Their faces, once unknown to the wider public, now appeared on television screens and newspapers nationwide. The horror of what they had done shattered the fragile peace of the suburbs they called home. In their confessions, the men detailed Anita's final hours in a manner chilling in its callousness. They spoke of kidnapping her near Blacktown Station, throwing her into a stolen car, and driving her to the isolated field. The coordinated nature of the crime was clear. It was a calculated act by a group united by violence, cruelty, and a disturbing loss of humanity. This was no random act of madness. It was a collective crime, a brutal display of dominance that would haunt Australia for years. The men, products of difficult lives and missed chances, had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The trial of Anita-Cobby's killers became one of the most watched in Australian history. By the time the 5 men were led into the courtroom, handcuffed and blank-faced, public sentiment had already sealed their fate in the court of opinion. They were not just on trial for what they had done to Anita. They had come to represent something larger: the failure of a system, the collapse of morality, the fragility of safety in ordinary life. The evidence was overwhelming. The wiretap recordings, the confessions, the forensic findings, all confirmed the horror that had unfolded in the dark field at Prospect. The prosecution presented a story so brutal that even seasoned reporters struggled to write it. The victim's injuries, documented clinically, spoke of suffering that lasted for hours. The court learned that Anita had endured the worst of humanity before her life was taken from her in a single final act of violence. The defense had little to offer. There were no pleas of innocence, no claims of mistaken identity. At best, they tried to fragment the narrative, hinting at individual levels of involvement. But it made no difference. The 5 had acted together. They had kidnapped, raped, tortured, and murdered a woman who had done nothing more than walk home after work. They had not lost control. They had embraced it. Outside the courtroom, the mood was volatile. Protesters gathered, many calling for the return of the death penalty. It had been abolished in New South Wales years earlier, but in the heat of this trial, the idea returned with force. People carried signs, shouted through megaphones, and demanded a punishment that could match the crime. Politicians were forced to respond. The media replayed the same photographs. Anita in her beauty queen sash, Anita in her nurse's uniform, and the grainy mugshots of the men who took her life. When the sentences were handed down, they were absolute. All 5 men received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. It was as close to permanent removal as the system allowed. The judge's words were damning, describing the crime as one of the worst in the country's history. There was no redemption in sight. The men left the courtroom for a prison system that would never release them. For Anita's family, the verdict brought no comfort. Her father had once said that he wished he could have died in her place. Her mother, often stoic before the press, broke down only in private. They had lost a daughter, and no measure of justice could replace that. But they had also lost their anonymity. For years, their grief would be public, shaped and reshaped by interviews, retrospectives, and documentaries. They became unwilling symbols of loss and resilience. In the end, justice was served by the system's standards, but the wounds left by the crime would not close so easily. Not for the family, not for Blacktown, not for Australia. In the years after the trial, the name Anita-Cobby never faded. It was whispered in schools, recalled on anniversaries, evoked whenever another act of violence tore through the nation. She became more than a victim. She became a symbol. Not just of tragedy, but of the quiet, everyday risks women face, of the failure of institutions to protect, of what happens when society chooses to look away until it's too late. Blacktown changed in the wake of her murder. The station where she took her last train became a site of uneasy memory. Streetlights were added, community programs expanded, and police presence grew. But no amount of urban planning could erase what had happened. There was a new awareness, a tension beneath the surface, especially for women walking alone at night. What once was ordinary now carried risk. The illusion of suburban safety had been shattered, and it could not be rebuilt. For Anita's parents, Gary and Grace Lynch, the loss became their life's purpose. They channeled their grief into advocacy, campaigning tirelessly for victims' rights and improved support for families affected by violent crime. They refused to let their daughter's death be reduced to a headline. Through their courage, they reshaped how Australia responded to tragedy, not with silence, but with action. The public, too, underwent a reckoning. There was a long overdue conversation about how Australia treated violence against women. The Cobby case helped fuel reforms, from parole system changes to broader social awareness. It marked a turning point, and although change came slowly, it came because the nation could no longer pretend such violence was an exception. Over the decades, Anita's story has been revisited many times, in books, in films, in classrooms. Each retelling carries the weight of sorrow, but also the warning she now represents. Her face, once crowned with a beauty queen smile, reminds Australians of how little separates the ordinary from the unthinkable. Her killers remain behind bars. Their names are remembered only because of what they took. But Anita-Cobby is remembered for how she lived. Kind, determined, generous. A nurse who cared for strangers. A daughter who called home. A woman who should have arrived safely that night. There is no restoring what was lost. But in memory, in reform, and in the lives touched by her story, Anita endures. Not as a headline, not as a case number, but as a name that Australia will never forget. If you've made it this far, it means you're enjoying the story. If you're interested in more, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a great story. This is Liam. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.